Do you know that God was kind enough to give us a prophetic layout of church history so we wouldn't have to argue about which church was the first church or the true church? Now, check this out. All of you have heard of the book of Revelation. Well, Revelation is basically a prophecy or a revealing of things to come. He uses symbolic imagery to communicate a vision of what's to take place in the future of the world and of the church. Now, imagine this. I'm going to give you an analogy. Imagine you're watching a parade. Now, if you're watching a parade from the ground level, you can see about 100 yards of what's happening. Let's say you see a float over here and a band over here, directly behind the float. You can kind of see what's happening. Well, imagine if you were 100 stories up and you had a telescope and you could see a mile this way and a mile this way and then directly straight down, and you could know exactly what's happening. Let's say you were up that high and you saw an accident happen, 10 blocks up. You could notify the rest of the parade, hey, stop, go a different direction because there's something happening over here. Or you could even go all the way to the other side and go, hey guys, there's something happening here. You can see the end from the beginning. Well, that's exactly what God did. He saw the end from the beginning, and he basically takes John up and says, John, here is church history and also world history. I want you to see what it looks like so that you can warn the church. So let's dig in. We're gonna dig into Revelation chapter 2 and 3. Now, in Revelation chapter 2 and 3, there are 7 churches that existed during that time. Now, there was actually probably more than that. There was possibly 30, 40, 50 churches. We know of at least 14, but he addresses 7 particular churches because they have things that are happening in those churches that are symbolic of things to come, okay? Again, the book of Revelation is a revealing about things to come, not about what's actually taking place. So the first church that he addresses is Ephesus. Now notice, these churches aren't named Grace Church or the Well Church or St. Patrick's Church or anything like that. They're named after the location of where these churches are. Well, there's first church is Ephesus. Now, I could go into details about some of the imagery that he uses that's really powerful for the people that lived in that area and how he uses that imagery to communicate some really cool stuff. I won't go into that right now. I have a study on that as well. But let's just look at a very small snapshot of what this looks like. So in Ephesus, the first thing that he addresses is 7 gold lampstands. Now, what are those? Well, those 7 gold lampstands, the lampstand is a light. Well, those are churches, the 7 churches, okay? One of the first things he says, and again, I'm just going to skim over things, is, I know thy works. This church was a church that was really working for the Lord. They were actively serving. They were very dedicated to God and serving the people in the community and doing wonderful things for the kingdom. And then he says this, I have tried them which say they are apostles and are not, and has found them liars. Now, one of the first things that happened in early New Testament Christianity is false apostles started coming into the church and bringing in false doctrines. And the church did a very good job, the early church, of saying, no, that's not true, no, that's not true, no, that's not true, so that the doctrine of the church could be preserved. They did a fabulous job of rejecting false apostles. So that's the first thing that he mentions. Then he compliments them for laboring. He says, but then he says something. He says, but you've lost your first love. Now, what is that about? Now, have you ever been in one of those churches that they have tons of programs and they have really good theology, but it's like, where's Jesus? Like, what's the point in all this if it's not about your first love? Now, if you're like me, when I was 17 years old, I gave my life to the Lord. I can remember my past, which was dark. I was partying and doing all kinds of bad things. And when I gave my life to Christ, my life literally transformed and I became new. It's kind of like the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul, I mean, for goodness sake, he had Stephen killed. He was an awful man. And yet, he came to know the Lord and his life forever changed. So it's like, listen, you've lost sight of your first love. Do you remember when you first met Jesus? That's what this passage is about. It's the Apostle Pauls of the world that had a past life and said, do you remember that? You're focusing on all this doctrine, and that's great. I appreciate the doctrine, but what's it about? It's about the saving grace of Jesus Christ, that God came in the flesh, died on a cross so that we could have everlasting life. I mean, that's what it's about. Let's not get too carried away about doctrine. If you're too carried away, you're missing the point. So, and that's what he says. You've lost sight of your first love. So they're working hard for the kingdom. They were diligent about making sure that no one came into the church with false doctrine. But their one area of weakness is they forgot what it's all about. So now he says this. He says he hates the practice of the Nicolaitans. Now, and he says, which I also hate. So the church hated them. And he says, I also hate them. I hate this practice. Now, this is huge. There was a first century group of people who promoted spiritual compromise, the blending of Christian worship with pagan practices. They also taught that Christians were free to engage in sinful behavior, in particular sexual behavior, because, hey, you're saved by grace. You can do whatever you want now. And so they were actively involved in trying to blend Christianity with paganism, and also, hey, you can still have your sexual and sinful lifestyles. That's who these people were. Now, here's what else is interesting about the word Nicolaitans. Nikeo means conquering or suppression of, and laity means the people. Well, what happened is this church, or this group of people within the church, what they tried to do is they had tried to establish a hierarchical structure within the church so that they could have power. Isn't it funny how people want power? So they were creating a hierarchical, basically a priesthood structure where they could control the church and manipulate the church. That's what Nikeo, conquering or suppression of, and laity means. It's conquering or having power over the people. And that's what every organization ultimately, I think, if you're not careful, you can kind of see it in a lot of organizations. They just want power and control. Well, that's what was happening. Now, he addressed another thing. He said the doctrine of Balaam. He brought this doctrine of Balaam up. There's an Old Testament story where Balaam tempted Israel into immorality and idolatry. These were people that were trying to make paganism and Christianity one thing. So anyway, let's move on. Let's go to the second church. Now, this is super cool. Anytime you see a word in really the Old Testament or New Testament, dig deeper into that word. There's something going on just in almost every word. There's power in the words. The word Smyrna is not just a word. Yeah, it's a location, but the word Smyrna, part of that word is the word myrrh. Now, how do you get the fragrance of myrrh? You get the fragrance of myrrh by crushing it. That's how you get the fragrance. That's what makes it smell beautiful. Well, it's interesting. The second church is this called Smyrna. It's a church that was just by chance. So here's what's interesting. The first church represents around 33 AD to about 100 AD. That's what was happening. That's exactly what was happening in the first church. They were concerned about doctrine, rejecting false doctrines. These people were creeping into the church like the Nicolaitans. So they were rejecting that. They were doing a good job, and he complimented them. Well, the second church is the church of Smyrna. It was a church, honestly, from 100 AD to about 325 AD that was severely persecuted. They were crushed, like the word myrrh. Now, he says, I know thy works, and thy tribulation, and thy poverty, but you're rich. So here's what's happening. Have you guys heard stories, and this is amazing, of some of the people during that time that they were severely persecuted? They would be hung upside down. They would be beaten. And during that time, they would witness. These persecutors would often come to know the Lord. You know, they were sent, the emperor, there was 10 evil Roman emperors during that time, which I'll address here in a second. They would insist that these Christians be put to death. So these persecutors who were putting these Christians to death would hear these testimonies and say, how can you have this much joy in the middle of this? And many of these persecutors came to know the Lord. It was really, must have been an amazing time. It's actually when the church grew exponentially, which is crazy, because the fact that the church exploded during a time of persecution doesn't even make sense. But he says, I know thy works and thy tribulation and thy poverty, but you're rich, meaning your faith is rich. It's beautiful. And then he says this, I know the blasphemy of those which say they are Jews, but are not. They're of the synagogue of Satan. Now in Romans, Paul is addressing this issue of faith. And he's trying to communicate to the Romans, but also Jewish people and whoever's listening, and to the church, obviously, because the letter was written for us to read it, is that faith is not about, it's not that you were born this religion and all of a sudden, therefore you're saved, you're good to go. No. What happened is, in Old Testament times, a lot of people believe that if you were born a Jew, you were automatically saved. And Paul addresses this. He says, no. You're not a Jew by birth. You're a Jew by faith. That it's not about being born into this. It's by the faith that you believe. You know, the Jewish people believed in a promised Messiah to come, and they believed in what God had told them and the laws that they had laid down to them, and it was belief that saved them. And so Romans spends the entire time on addressing this idea, is that belief and faith is what saved us, not a religion. And he addresses the Jews. It's listen, you weren't saved by being a Jew. You were saved by the faith that you professed as a Jew. So anyway, that says, I know thy tribulation and poverty, though. I know the blasphemy that say they are Jews, but are not. There were people that were claiming to be Jews, but they were not. They were Jews outward or physically because they were born into the Jewish faith, but they weren't by faith, and they were persecuting the church. Let's go on. Now, first, like I said, from about 100 AD to 325 AD, the church endured heavy persecution. Some of the persecution came from the Jews. Now, this is very theologically important. In Paul's letters, he's addressing this whole Jewish by faith thing. But now this is powerful. Then he goes on to say that you will have tribulation 10 days. Now again, imagine you're John and you're up on this platform or whatever, and you're looking down at the church and you see 10 days. So imagine you see these 10 days. What are those 10 days? It's kind of interesting because from 100 AD to 325 AD, there were 10 evil Roman emperors that did everything they could to stamp out Christianity, with the last one being the worst, and it was Diocletian. So John, all he sees is 10 days, 10 times where these emperors were trying to stamp out Christianity. I think it's interesting that John says this, but then there were also 10 evil Roman emperors. Now, so that was the second church, okay, the church of Smyrna. Now he goes to the third church. The third church, again, pay attention to the names. Names were very important. Pergamos. What does Pergamos mean? Where do we get the word per? Think about the word per. Per means mixed or objectionable, like pervert, perversion. So that means mixed or objectionable. Gamos is where we get polygamy, monogamy, right? So what does pergamos mean? Pergamos. It means mixed marriage. Pay attention to that. Very important. He says, I'm going to go down a couple points because I can't address all of this, but he says, I have a few things against you, though he has them, he says that they hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to cast a stumbling block before the children of Israel. Now, Balaam advised Balak to entice the Israelites into sinning against God, specifically through sexual immorality and idolatry. Balaam advised Balak to use Moabite women to seduce the Israelite men into immoral relationships. The aim was to lure the Israelites into worshiping the idol of Baal, Peor, breaking the covenant with God. So he lures them in so that the Israelites merge themselves with the idols and the pagan entities of Baal, right? That's what ends up happening. So now you've got this marriage of Israelite women to pagan women. And imagine how that happens in a marriage. So you got half of them are pagan, half of them are Christian. How do you deal with that, right? Well, let's go on. Now, keep in mind, God through John is talking about spiritual stuff. He's not talking about physical marriage. This is a spiritual message that he's given them. This refers to leading believers into compromise. Okay? Again, later, just down the verse, he says the same thing again about the practice of the Nicolaitans, right? Remember, what did the Nicolaitans do? They tried to blend paganism with Christianity. So notice in the third church, 3 things. Number 1, the name Pergamos means mixed marriage. Number 2, the story of Balaam. What was the story of Balaam? We just talked about that. It's mixing Judaism with paganism. That's what Balaam tried to do. Well, who were the Nicolaitans? The Nicolaitans were the people who tried to mix Christianity with paganism. Well, what's really interesting, what happens in around 325 AD? So what we've already learned is that the Church of Smyrna endured 10 evil Roman emperors, with Diocletian being the last. Well, all of a sudden, around 325, around that time period, Constantine becomes the next Roman emperor. And what happens with Constantine? He has this supposed conversion experience where it's kind of hard to explain. He has this battle at Milvain, and he knows he's probably going to lose, so he decides to pray to the Christian God, wins the battle, but he doesn't himself want to give up his paganism. He wants to blend Christianity with paganism because he feels like they're mergeable. Well, what happens in that time? Well, now he says, okay, even though 10 Roman emperors tried to wipe out Christianity, he says, you know what, we're not doing that anymore. We're going to let Christians worship freely as long as they submit to me. Remember the practice of the Nicolaitans, conquering or suppression of. So now, if you wanted to be a Christian, you could be a Christian, but you had to submit to the Church of Rome. Nikeo, conquering or suppression of laity, the people. Now you have this church, this organization that has merged paganism with Christianity, and the leaders are conquering or suppressing the church. Now you have to be a Christian under this Church of Rome, or you're not saved. That's what they later started teaching. Now, we could go on and on to the next church, the next church, and the next church. But the idea is, I want to give you an idea of what happened for the first 300 years of Christianity. Again, from 33 AD to 100 AD, that was Ephesus. Smyrna was from about 100 AD to about 325 AD. Pergamos, mixed marriage, is when the church blended paganism with Christianity, developed a hierarchical structure, and said, now you must submit to us. Who is that? That's Roman Catholicism. Now, if you go on further to the next church, you'll see how the church adopted a lot of pagan traditions. Pagan temples became Christian churches. Pagan worship practices became Christian worship practices, and the story goes on. Now, what's amazing is that God was kind enough. We don't have to argue about this. God showed us in church history this layout. It's as clear as a bell when you just use the imagery and use the stories that he's trying to communicate to tell the church what happened. Now, what's notice about this is in every passage, I think pretty much every church that he addresses, the 7 churches, he says, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. What does that mean? He says, listen, I need all of you to hear this. Not just one church, not just Ephesus, not just Smyrna, not just Pergamos, not just Thyatira. I need all of you to hear this, because this is where you're going to mess up. And what's amazing, had the church heeded this early on, this wouldn't have happened. So my challenge is for you to dig into this yourself. It's powerful. Go deeper. There's a lot of studies online. Chuck Missler's got a really good one that you can go deep, verse by verse, and dig deep. You can go to RomanCatholicism.com, check that out. That's also very deep. But hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks so much for watching, and God bless.